Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today, because we're diving into something really profound. History isn't just forged in stuffy boardrooms or by sweeping pieces of legislation. A lot of the time, it's forged in the fire of profound conflict and honestly unimaginable tragedy. We're going to explore how 5 very distinct, incredibly intense moments acted as real catalysts for American culture and law. These aren't just isolated events, right? They're literally the pressure points that forced a young, constantly evolving nation to take a hard look in the mirror and change.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We've got 5 main stops: clashes on the frontier, the ashes of Greenwood, the crime of the century, awakening a divided nation, and finally, echoes of American history.
So here's the 79-year narrative arc we'll be traveling. We kick things off in 1876 with the Battle of Little Bighorn, then move to the 1881 Corral gunfight. From there, we jump ahead to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, uncover the 1932 Lindbergh kidnapping, and bring it up to the 1955 murder of Emmett Till. As we move through this timeline, keep an eye on how this evolving nation struggled through its absolute darkest moments to try and figure out what American justice actually means.
All right, Section 1. Clashes on the frontier, myths and realities of the Wild West. I want you to imagine standing on a windswept hill in the dead of summer, 1876. The air is just thick with dust, horses are echoing across the plains, and 2 entirely different worlds are violently colliding. Now, pop culture almost always feeds us this legend of Custer's last stand, right? But the reality was a massive military miscalculation. It all started when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. This was sacred land supposedly protected by treaty, but thousands of miners rushed in anyway. When native leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse rightly refused to surrender their ancestral home, the U.S. military went on the offensive. And Custer? Well, he drastically underestimated the sheer size of the United Native Coalition. It resulted in a devastating, total defeat for his command. But tragically, despite this monumental victory for the native groups, the aftermath just brought even heavier military operations that ultimately forced them onto reservations.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how our whole understanding of frontier justice got completely warped by basically half a minute of chaos. Just 5 years after Little Bighorn, in 1881, we hit the gunfight at the OK Corral. The myth we all know is this heroic, righteous 30-second shootout where Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday valiantly take down the bad guys. But the reality? Well, it was a super messy clash driven by really complex frontier politics between the town lawmen and a faction called the Cowboys. That 30-shot confrontation left 3 men dead, but it definitely didn't end there. It actually triggered a bloody, months-long vigilante vendetta ride all across the Arizona territory. Yet somehow, this one brief flash of violence morphed into the ultimate romanticized symbol of the Wild West.
Moving on to Section 2, the ashes of Greenwood, the erasure of Black Wall Street.
Okay, shift your mindset for a second. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the deafening sound of gunfire and looking outside to see your entire neighborhood burning to the ground. It's the summer of 1921, and we're stepping right into the deep, deep racial divisions of post-World War I America. But look, before we talk about the tragedy, we absolutely have to understand the triumph. Because of strict segregation, the residents of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, built this incredibly successful, completely self-sustaining community of their own. It became famously known as Black Wall Street. We're talking luxury hotels, restaurants, doctors, lawyers, and just incredibly successful entrepreneurs. The wealth there was immense. These families were building a bright future, proving that sheer determination could overcome some of the most enormous racial obstacles imaginable.
But sadly, that amazing prosperity was met with intense hostility, and things escalated incredibly fast. Step 1 was the elevator incident. On May 30th, a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland had this very unclear encounter with a white elevator operator named Sarah Page. Sensationalized newspaper rumors of an assault spread like absolute wildfire. That leads to Step 2. An angry white mob gathers at the courthouse where Rowland is being held. A group of black veterans arrive to try and prevent a lynching, a shot rings out, and utter chaos erupts. And that leads directly into Step 3, the absolute, systematic destruction of Greenwood over the next 2 days, as an armed white mob descended on the neighborhood.
35. I really want that number to sink in. 35 entire city blocks were systematically looted and burned to ashes by thousands of armed white attackers. Eyewitnesses literally reported private airplanes flying overhead, just observing the violence and dropping incendiary devices onto the homes and businesses right below them. It's hard to fathom, but in less than 24 hours, thousands of people were left entirely homeless, and generations of hard-earned wealth were just wiped off the map.
But the most devastating number of all is 300. See, official reports at the time listed only around 36 deaths, and they deliberately labeled the whole thing a riot, so insurance companies could deny the residents' claims. But modern historical research, it estimates that up to 300 people were killed. And honestly, perhaps the most shocking part of this whole story is the decades of deliberate historical silence that followed. This massive event was just erased from history books. It was rarely ever spoken of, until survivors and historians worked tirelessly, decades later, to uncover the mass graves and preserve the memory of exactly what was lost.
All right, Section 3. The crime of the century. The Lindbergh kidnapping.
Imagine going to sleep in 1932, right in the middle of the Great Depression, only to wake up and find out that the most famous baby in all of America had vanished from his crib on a cold, rainy New Jersey night. You have to understand, Charles Lindbergh wasn't just famous. After flying solo across the Atlantic, the guy was a global superstar. He and his wife, Anne Mora Lindbergh, were America's it couple, and their 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., was literally known as America's baby. So when a homemade ladder and a ransom note were found right outside his empty nursery window, it sparked this unprecedented media frenzy and a massive nationwide manhunt. The entire country was holding its breath, and the devastation was just absolute when 2 months later, the child's body was discovered in the woods just a few miles from their home.
It took 2 years, but a breakthrough finally happened, with the arrest of a German-born carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. And the evidence against him was really compelling. Some of the ransom money, which had been paid in traceable gold certificates, was found hidden right in his garage. Handwriting experts matched his writing to the ransom notes, and on top of that, investigators found wood in his possession that perfectly matched the homemade ladder left at the crime scene. Now, Hauptmann maintained his innocence right up to the very end, claiming the money actually belonged to a deceased business associate, but he was convicted in a highly publicized trial and executed in 1936.
Now, this tragedy didn't just shock the public, it permanently shifted American law. The whole ordeal made it painfully clear that local police were just completely overwhelmed by a crime of this magnitude. So Congress stepped in and passed the Federal Kidnapping Act, which became widely known as the Lindbergh Law. This was a huge deal because it granted federal authorities, like the FBI, the power to step in and investigate kidnappings that cross state lines. So this one family's devastating loss actually resulted in a permanent, sweeping change to modern American federal law enforcement.
Let's move to Section 4, Awakening a Divided Nation, the tragedy of Emmett Till.
Imagine being a cheerful 14-year-old boy, just super excited for a summer vacation visiting family, only to become the victim of horrific, fatal violence simply because of the deeply segregated social rules of the American South. In August of 1955, Emmett Till traveled down from Chicago to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. On August 24th, Emmett had some sort of interaction at a local grocery store with a white clerk named Carolyn Bryant. Accounts really differ on what actually happened. Maybe a whistle, maybe a playful remark, but in the strict, segregated South, that perceived interaction provoked deadly retaliation. Just days later, Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, kidnapped Emmett in the middle of the night. He was brutally murdered, and his heavily beaten body was discovered later in the Tallahatchie River.
And what happens next is just a profound illustration of the power of a mother's bravery. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made a decision that quite literally changed the world. She famously declared, "Let the world see what I've seen," and insisted on holding an open casket funeral back in Chicago. Photographs of her son's mutilated body were published in black magazines and newspapers all across the country. She forced America to look directly at the brutal, ugly reality of racial violence. Her extraordinary courage transformed her own unimaginable personal grief into an urgent, undeniable national call for justice.
The trial that followed, however, was a glaring display of systemic injustice. An all-white jury deliberated for roughly an hour, before delivering a not guilty verdict for the two men. And because they were protected by double jeopardy laws, Bryant and Millam later just openly confessed to the murder in a magazine interview, knowing they couldn't be retried. But this specific, infuriating aftermath served as a massive catalyst. The national outrage ignited by Emmett's death, combined with his mother's incredible bravery, directly inspired civil rights leaders. In fact, it helped spark the Montgomery bus boycott just months later, effectively launching the modern civil rights movement.
And finally, Section 5, Echoes of American History, Turning Points.
So if we step back and really look at the journey we've just taken, we can see how all these events are intimately connected. From the 1870s frontier clashes driven by rapid expansion to the terrifying racial violence that completely erased a prosperous Greenwood in the 1920s.
from a massive celebrity kidnapping that actually redefined federal law in the 30s, to a mother's devastating grief in the 1950s that awakened the conscience of a divided nation. You see, these tragedies weren't just isolated moments in time, they were the actual turning points that shaped the culture, the laws, and the very character of America. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. How does preserving the memory of our most painful history shape the justice of our future? Because whether it's clearing away those Hollywood myths of the Wild West or unearthing the suppressed truths of Black Wall Street, remembering the absolute darkest chapters of our past is really the only way we can demand a brighter, more just future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions,